he was questioned. Mortal, have you seen what they are doing? They're doing it in the dark, each in his room of images. We're looking into the idolatry of Israel in the Old Testament and the idolatry and Judaism that was coming into the church. Now, first of all, we're going to look at the book of Ezekiel chapter 8. In Ezekiel chapter 8, he was, of course, in Babylon, in his house, and the elders of Judah were sitting before him. And while he was there before those elders, probably about 70, the hand of the Lord fell upon him. And he looked, and there was a figure like a human being. And below what appeared to be its loins it was fire, and above that the appearance of brightness like gleaming amber. It stretched out the form of a hand, and took him by a lock of his head, and the Spirit lifted him up between the earth and the heaven, and brought him in the visions of God to Jerusalem. So he's halfway up to heaven and halfway down to earth, in an atmosphere not quite like heaven, and neither was it quite like earth. An area where the Spirit of God had free access to his heart and mind and whole being. And he was taken in visions of God to Jerusalem, because Jerusalem still existed at that time. There was still the temple there. It had not yet been sacked totally or plundered totally. There was still people of Judah left behind in Israel of the day, which of course was which had been the territory possessed by Judah and Benjamin. But the 10 tribes of Israel, of course, had been scattered some centuries before. So there he arrives in his vision to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court, looking north. And there was a seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. That's what he saw. He saw the idol of jealousy that originally had been placed there by King Manasseh of Judah, a very evil king. There's quite a history about Manasseh. He was the only son of Hezekiah, who was a godly king. And Manasseh, after his father died, allowed his whole being to be taken over by Satan. And if you have ever heard of that book, The Ascension of Messiah, you would be thrilled to read the actualities that occurred in the life of Isaiah in relation to Manasseh, who said he was going to kill Isaiah. And Manasseh, after his father died, put up altars to Baal. And he also had an Asherah. This is what he did in worship. He made his son pass through the fire. He practiced witchcraft. He used divination. He had mediums and spiritists. And you read about that in 2 Kings 21, verse 3. Now, an Asherah was a Canaanite goddess and a goddess of some of the other countries there, the goddess of love. And she was said in the Kabbalah that had begun to exist at that time in the land of Babylon. And of course there had been a Kabbalah for centuries, originating from Egypt. It did not originate with the Hebrews. It originated before their time, and the Hebrews took it up, particularly when they were in captivity in Babylon. And the idea of a god and a goddess was in the Kabbalah. This goddess is the wife of Yahweh, YHWH, the Tetragrammaton, or, as we read in our English translations, Jehovah. And even in Psalm 68, it says his name is Jah, or Yah. That is not the name of God. That's a lie that has been implanted in the King James Version and other versions. The Greek version, the Septuagint, does not contain Jah. The Greek Septuagint says it truly. His name is the Lord. Yahweh is a witchcraft word, and it has been imposed upon the Christians in their Bibles. This idea, because in the English Bible, about 6,000 times in the Old Testament, you'll find Lord capitalized. I've been reading it since I was a child, and we were told years ago that it really stood for Jehovah, which of course stood for Yahweh. And we were told that the Jews so revered the name that they didn't want it printed. Well, Christians can never revere the name of Jehovah. We can never revere the name of Yahweh. It is a witchcraft name. It comes from the Kabbalah, a book of mysticism. And also in relation to Asherah, you will read often, as I have done in some of the prophets, particularly in Isaiah, how that the children of Israel worshipped under the groves of trees. And of course there were images in the trees. I don't know if you ever woke up to that, if you have read those portions of the scripture, which if you've been a Christian for a long time, I hope you have. She was the goddess of love and of war, and the mother of 70 gods, a pantheon of gods in Canaan. And this was a sin of Judah before captivity, because they had gone into that sin under Manasseh and under kings before that time. But after Manasseh, there was a godly king called Jehoiakim. It was around that time that the children of Israel were taken into captivity. Now when Ezekiel in vision arrived at the entrance of the court, this is what occurs in verse 7. When he came to the entrance of the court, he saw there was a hole in the wall. And the Spirit, or the Lord, spoke to him and said, "Mortal, dig through the wall." And he dug through the wall and found an entrance. And he was told, "Go in and see the vile abominations that they are committing here." These were the people of God, not a holy people of God. By and large, Israel of the Old Testament was never a holy people of God. And there were those who followed the Lord So Ezekiel in verse 10 went in his vision. Now whether he was there in person or not, it is not apparent, but it was as if he were not there. He was there in spirit. And he went in and looked, and he saw writing on the wall, paintings on the wall, goddesses on the wall, creeping things, loathsome animals, and all the idols of the house of Israel. Now you notice, who is there in the land? What tribes? Judah and Benjamin, not the 10 tribes of Israel. They and their king had departed long before. But whether it was the 12 tribes or 2 tribes, God still considered it was the house of Israel. And he saw the 70 of the elders of the house of Israel standing there. And each had his censer in his hand, with a fragrant cloud of incense ascending. And he was questioned, "Mortal, have you seen what they are doing? They're doing it in the dark, each in his room of images." Once in India, we were asked to visit a person. I was asked to talk to her. She had been a friend of the person who asked me to go. They had been to school together, and she knew of the gospel. But she had married this Hindu. And so we went to the house, and we were shown to the sitting room, and we could look through the door at a small room full of little idols arrayed in rows. There could have been from 200 to 500 little idols. So it's a common thing in heathen countries to have that number of idols. And it was a common thing in Israel. Would you consider that nation a holy nation? Would you consider those people a holy people? Would you consider the Hindus who worship those idols they have a holy people? Well, if you do, you are not a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ. Then he was brought to the entrance of the north gate, and the north gate generally was only entered by the descendants of David. But he could see that there were others there. There were women. And this is what they were doing. It was a greater abomination to the Lord, because they were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Now there's a story about Tammuz, because Tammuz was supposed to be the son or husband of some goddess, and there's quite a story about it. I just forget the details of it right now. I'm not keen to remember the details of idolatry. We lived in Indonesia. I just wanted to know as little as I could know. And when we went to India, we never studied idolatry. But we would pick up little things about it. And I have read a book about it. And in fact, I bought a book about it and was so vile that I threw it in the rubbish bin. We don't have to know too much about idolatry, but we do need to know enough to know what idolatry is. And then Ezekiel was told, "You will see greater abominations than this." And this is what he saw. Between the porch and the altar of the entrance to the temple, he saw 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and prostrating themselves to the sun worship. You see, The elders of Judah were worshipping according to the idolatry of Egypt. They were the idols of the house of Israel. Doubtless, when they left Egypt, they brought idols with them. Do you remember the story of Jacob and Rachel? How she sat on her idol when somebody wanted to come in and wasn't supposed to, and she's continued sitting and told a lie because she was hiding her household idol. So, without a doubt, the children of Israel brought idols out of Egypt. But not only that, they continued in idolatry. You look at the book of Judges, generation after generation. They left off following the Lord, and then he would send a judgment on them. Then they would cry out to the Lord, and that generation would come back to the Lord. And that's the story of the book of Judges. I hope you've read that. I hope you spend a lot of time studying those scriptures to know what they are about. It takes a lot of doing. Now in Ezekiel 23, Ezekiel had been told by the Spirit, which he wrote, that there were two adulterous sisters in Israel, Jerusalem and Samaria, counted as Israel in the land of Judah. And it says there, she played the harlot in the land of Egypt and of Syria. She lusted after their gods, and the Chaldeans, to whom she sent messages as she lusted after those idols. So the Babylonians came with their idols, their sexual idolatry, full of love, as recorded in that chapter, the love of immoral sexuality. God said what she had done, if you read it. And I know that the heathen festivals of India, as I have been told by a pastor who went there to evangelize while they were having their festivals, I think he put himself in a dangerous situation, but he said there was homosexuality and immorality and lesbianism. And I know very well of the immorality because you read about it in the newspapers, how that a man will give his child to the temple and so forth. This is what the children of Israel did. God said then she longed for the lewdness of her youth in Egypt. You see, in Egypt she was idolatrous. And the lewdnesses included prostitution. And in verse 22, God said, I will stir up your loves against you. And that was against both sisters. Today, if the church follows suit, not with that kind of idolatry, but with an alliance with idolaters, will not God stir up those people with whom she is in alliance against her? Maybe that is what is occurring in the USA, with those who have taken over the country having been the ones the church lusted after and loved. So in Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 14, where the women were weeping for the god Tammuz, it was an annual event. And they sat there near the place of sacrifice and placed there an image that was heated inwardly, that had eyes of lead. Then on top of that, these elders were observing The abomination of sun worship of Egypt. Sun worship in many ways was the commencement of their idolatry and of the world's idolatry. The name Yahweh was the name of the goddess of the moon. If I were a Christian now that I know it, I would never use the name Yahweh or Jehovah or Yeshua. They all come from the same base with similar meanings. We should realize there was always an elect and a remnant, but the rest of the nation was absorbed in idolatry. So what we see about Israel throughout the Old Testament is almost total backsliddenness. She's always backslidden. I say and fear that has been the position of the Church of Jesus Christ from the 1st century onwards. They were the idols of the house of Israel. Doubtless, when they left Egypt, they brought idols with them.